Number 1. Peeping Tom. I hope I haven't already sent you this. This should have been the first part because it happened before the events of 1992, in 1991. In September 1991, I was living in a small quiet apartment in Nampa, Idaho. Back then the rent was only $225 a month. There were about a dozen one-story units in a staple shape, in a courtyard, and most of my neighbors were easy to get along with, all except one. I'd be in my room or the living room, and hear shuffling outside my window several times. I didn't think much of it until I heard it again after a phone conversation. I looked out the back window to see some guy, hunched over, running away. I was so pissed, and I hoped he hadn't heard too much of what I said, or worse, was scoping out my space to try and break and enter. This had been going on for a couple months. Well, soon after, it stopped. At least physically. One day I was watching a movie when I heard a bunch of commotion outside. I went out to see my landlady smoking as she watched cops milling around and through bodies being taken into ambulances and stretchers. The cops wouldn't explain what was going on, but my landlady did. She told me the young man who lived a couple doors down had gotten into a fight with two women and then killed them. After that, he had killed himself. All of this happened in broad daylight, and I never heard anything. I knew it was the guy who had been spying on me. I was in a state of shock. It all happened so suddenly. I was glad he was gone, but felt sorry for the female victims. Part of my shock was knowing how close I had been to being one of them. I knew he was a creep, but not a psychopath. It took a while for the ambulances to clear out, and the park to get quiet again. It was a few months later I had the experiences I mentioned in my last post. It was unnerving to know the angry ghost was the same guy. 3 years later, my sister lived there, and I went to babysit her kid a few times. Her daughter was just a toddler then, and woke up crying one night. At the same time, I saw a faint shadow stand behind the living room light. The light dimmed and brightened slowly 3 times. I froze in shock. I wondered if it was the same ghost as 3 years before that. It creeped me out to think he did it 3 times to show me the 3 deaths of him and the 2 women he'd killed. I never told my sister because I didn't want her to freak out and hoped the ghost left her daughter alone. She moved out not long after that, but I wondered if she saw anything. What's worse than having a peeping Tom is one who continues being one after death. For those who do not remember the first part of the story, here it is again. I've been binge-watching your videos on my long days driving for Grubhub, and was happy to see your email for submitting stories. Most of mine are paranormal. I don't want to overwhelm your schedule with too many, so I'll start with this one. This happened in 1992. You wouldn't think such a small apartment that was more like a dollhouse would be haunted. It has an open room for the living room and the kitchen, and 2 even smaller rooms for the bathroom and bedroom. I lived there for 5 months. The first incident happened in November, just a month after I moved in. I was awakened by a long, black, man-shaped whirling mass just inches from my face. It has no face, but moved his head like he was looking back and forth between my face and my body. He also made some motions with his bottom half, like he was trying to have sex with me, but I couldn't feel it. I screamed at this thing to get off of me, and he flew backwards into the wall behind him, till he quickly faded to a smaller gray shadow. Years later, when I watched the Entity movie about the woman assaulted by a demon or evil ghost in California, it was all too familiar. Later I found out from my landlord that some guy had offed himself in that house, and now I was stuck with it. Nothing happened until 3 weeks later. This manifestation was even more disturbing because it was solid. Again, he woke me up sitting on my bed. He leaned over me and I could feel my feet rolling into his weight. I woke up in a panic, and no one was there. I also felt an angry presence in my room shortly before that, so I knew something was going to happen. I thought, that's it, I'm out of here. I moved out a month later. Cliffhanger, this may have been the same young guy who killed 2 women then himself. I'd been there when I saw the bodies being carried, and my landlady told me. Number 2. Sorry it's been a long time, since I had some time to type this out. When I was in my early 20s and newly married, we lived in the city Yakima in Washington State. Let me start out by saying I have insomnia, so it helps me relax to put on headphones and take a walk. This was one of those nights. It was summer and not dark yet. I would say maybe around 8ish. I was pregnant at the time and needed to relax. I had a CD player and the batteries went dead. I then heard someone behind me. They were a couple feet behind me, and every time I turned a corner, they would turn. So I pretended not to notice, and I started speed walking. I ducked behind a bush and they went past me. I then got to my street and went home. The next night, we both were walking our dog, and the same guy started following us, and I told my husband that he was the same guy who followed me last night. He turned around quickly and said, "If you don't stop following us, I will call the cops." The guy turned around and left, walking the opposite way, but it doesn't end there. The next day I got up to a banging on my front door, and I walked down the hallway and saw through the window the same guy. We called the cops, and he was gone before they got there. I ended up becoming a shut-in, and when I needed to go somewhere, I would try to get a ride with anyone who would. We moved to another part of the same neighborhood, and the guy who was following me was now my brand new neighbor. And it gets worse. So one day, at our new place, I see him in the courtyard. I freaked out and got back inside. I called the cops and told them he was my new neighbor, and the story behind his antics. I said he was in the courtyard, and they sent a cop out. Unfortunately, since they said a crime hadn't been committed, they couldn't do anything for me. But that if any problems happen, I can just report them to my apartment manager. I was constantly on guard, but it seems he had just vanished. He no longer lived there, and nobody knew anything about where he was or what he was doing. I know this isn't as scary, but it was to me. I was constantly terrified about running into him. Thank you for reading this, and here is a pic of my Killer Orange Cat Juju. He is a 35-pound chonker. You can show him in your video if you want. Number 3. The Cement Slab. After I'd biked from Oakland, California, down Highway 1, Highway 101, and Interstate 5 along the California coast, I turned east at San Diego, caught I-10 at Ontario, and headed across the Anza Borrego Desert, up over the peninsular coastal mountains, about 8,000 feet, and across the Sonoran Desert to where I-10 split, north to Phoenix and south to Tucson. For some inexplicable reason at the time, I chose south. Of course, a 35-knot tailwind and 3% grade, almost the entire 116 miles, had a lot to do with it. But sometimes I still wonder how different things might have been had I turned north instead of south on that fateful day 43 years ago. I was staying with a friend I'd met, working at an Italian restaurant as a dishwasher, so I'd stay over only on the nights that I worked, to about 1 a.m. But every chance I got, I'd be bicycling the 30 miles up the Santa Catalina Highway to the top of Mount Lemmon, running 7 miles twice a day across Tucson, or doing survival hikes up and over the Santa Catalinas, the Venikins, or the Santa Rita Mountains. After an 11-week survival in Yosemite a year earlier, there were little more than short excursions to keep fit. I had planned on completing my tour by continuing east on I-10 to the Atlantic coast in Jacksonville, Florida, my hometown. Because Tucson is surrounded by desert, naturally occurring food and water are more scarce than in the Sierra Nevadas, the Southern Rockies, or the Cascades, let alone Jacksonville, Florida. So my longest survival in Tucson usually lasted only a few weeks. By the time I ridden my touring bike up as far as I could to the end of the canyon, about 4 miles, and walked the rest of the way, it was already starting to get dark. Since I started late and always preferred the utmost privacy, I pitched camp in an old picnic area that was no longer being used. It was considered off limits due to rock slides and large tracts of eroded rail beds suddenly falling off the side of the cliff. It was a little early in the year, too, April, but the weather had been fair, and the still visible snowcaps on Mount Lemmon, the Rincon, and the Santa Ritas meant the streams were running, and I wouldn't have to carry as much water. After I completed my asanas, yoga, and finished my power food supper, a regimen I'd learned while in survival in Yosemite, I was just hunkering down to sleep when a cold wind started to creep down from Mount Lemmon. Sabino Canyon has an elevation of about 3,500 feet, and this sudden temperature drop felt like it was coming from somewhere around 9,000 plus feet because of the distinct smell of snow. Because it was in the mountains, in April, the sun set early, about 6 p.m., but about 2 hours later, I woke, chilled, not expecting a temperature drop from about 85 degrees to what felt like 40. I had only thought to bring a bivy sack and liner, good to about 20 degrees above and adequate against light rain. So when I woke in the pitch dark, with thick moisture-laden clouds obscuring the starlight and the remoteness of my location, I knew I was in for whatever was coming, and it probably wasn't good. After doing my pranayama, yogic breathing, to regulate my heart rate and calm the nerves, I woke up again about 2 hours later, because as fate would have it, it began to rain. The warmer rain eased the temperature back up a little, and because I had my bivy sack liner, I was at least dry, for the time being. I could hear thunder off in the distance, up on the Lemon, and saw scant intermittent flashes of lightning to the north and east. When I awoke again, the storm had moved to what felt like it had to be right directly over me. The crashing of the thunder, almost deafening when you're in the mountains or high elevation, woke me with the start, and the rain that followed was a deluge, soaking my bivy and myself to the bone. Because of the storm and rain and wind, with gusts to about 50 knots, there was nothing I could do but lay low and go into an extended Bhastrika pranayama bellows breath, force-controlled breathing for about 30 minutes, whereby through forced inhalation and exhalation I was able to make myself warm up to the extent of feeling hot. What woke me up the third time was not so much the flashes of lightning, the smell of ozone, or the crashing of thunder like being in an avalanche or mudslide, or that the rain had turned to sleet, and I was about under 8 inches of ice and freezing water, but the strangely incongruous sounds of voices, human voices. Through the din I could just make out what sounded like a man talking to what sounded like a woman, or maybe it was 2 men and 1 woman. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but at one point they were laughing until I heard what sounded like a hard, dull, and heavy thud that shook the ground. I remember thinking that here I am, in the middle of a freak ice and snowstorm about 10 miles north of Tucson, with ear-splitting thunder, the ground shaking like an earthquake, and a howling wind that sounded like a pack of wolves on the scent. And at the same time, there were these people, laughing, joking, cutting up, and generally acting like it was a summer's day at the beach. Through chattering teeth and probably a not too mild case of hypothermia, I found the incongruity of my situation and theirs to be almost laughable. Ever tried laughing through clenched, chattering teeth? Better keep your mouth shut, or you'll bite the inside of your cheek, your lip, or your tongue off. Apparently I'd passed out again, but this time I awoke to the sound of nothing. Total silence. I woke to find myself about under a foot of ice and snow, and was now definitely freezing. I kept remembering when I used to deliver papers after school during an Iowa snowstorm. We'd moved from Florida to Iowa when I was about 5 years old. With the temperature at about 32 degrees and a wind chill of about 20, and suddenly feeling very sleepy. I was still about 3 miles from home and thought about lying down on the sidewalk and taking a quick nap when this voice came out of the storm, scolding me and saying, "Don't you lay in that snow, you hear me, or you'll freeze." So I didn't. I made it home, frozen, got my ass kicked for being late, and lived to tell this and hopefully many more stories to come. Mustering every bit of willpower I had left, I scratched camp, which under the circumstances meant folding my bivvy sack with the bag still in it, and the liner stiffly in half, unlocking my bike with hands that were so cold I couldn't feel the key or the lock, in rain-sodden clothes that were freezing to my legs, arms, and back. I managed, nonetheless, to tuck everything under one arm and my bike under the other and trudge across the frozen ground downhill to the nearest bathroom, about a half mile, slipping and sometimes just sliding on the ice along the way. I fell twice, until I got there. Along the way I passed a picnic tabletop, a concrete slab, lying on its side in the snow, with no visible footprints, handprints, tracks, debris, litter, or anything explaining how it came to be that way. From the direction I'd heard the laughing during the storm, the slab was pretty well adjacent, but then again, it was a raging storm with ear-shattering sounds and torrential wind, rain, and ice coming from every direction. Granted, there was a lot of snow, but the slab looked like it had been on its side for a long time, years perhaps. Weeds were growing up through the snow, around the edge, still stuck in the ground. The sun and use had stained the top, but the underside was pristine white, except for some old cobwebs. This perplexed me, as exhausted, I tried my strength to move the slab, even just a little, but was unable to do so. It felt like it had to weigh at least 400 pounds. I rode back a week later, after everything had melted, and the weather was back to normal, and it was still there, like it probably had been for years. As I said, this was a remote area that no one used anymore. I reached the bathroom, at least it was dry and out of the wind, and tried to make myself comfortable in my thoroughly drenched clothes and gear, until sunup, which was still about 3 hours away. Amazingly, no one came in, and I assumed it was because of the severity of the storm, the snow, and the condition of the surrounding terrain, where only an idiot would be out in weather like this. Or, so I deemed myself ironically, but a lucky idiot indeed, as it turned out. Since my clothes and gear were no longer frozen solid, even though I felt like I was, and to the bone, I managed to get everything relatively packed and back in the panniers, and once I reached the road, headed the 12 miles back down the mountain and across Tucson to home, in my friend's warm apartment. Along the way I noticed cars that had slid off the side of the road or were abandoned altogether because the ice was so slick and too dangerous to gambit. Other bicyclist tire tracks showed they'd tried to ride too, up to a point, but were forced to turn back. It looked like it had snowed almost 11 inches, but because of the dryness and warmth of the Sonoran Desert, even at higher altitudes, most of it was melted off before I even got back to Tucson. When I arrived, my friend took one look at me and said, "Take the bed." Normally I slept on the floor. After months of sleeping on the ground, sometimes on solid rock, beds were just too hot and too soft. But this time I accepted the invitation with near complete abandon. My friend said I fell where I stood and didn't move the entire time I slept. Fortunately for me, that was abandon enough for him. I slept, passed out, or was unconscious until about 2 days later. My friend told me he checked in on me twice, but because I'd virtually not moved a muscle the whole time, he decided to just let me have the bed, and he slept on the couch. Once I got up, or rose from the dead, and got myself moving again, I started thinking about what happened and how. Tucson weather deemed this a once-in-a-100-year weather event. There were 2 human casualties reported, and a lot of livestock lost. Tucson had open range for cattle back then, due to flash freezing, sleet, ice, snow, and hypothermia. The extreme cold ended up killing off a lot of cacti too, especially the giant saguaros. You could still see their black, broken-armed husks years later. When I think about the voices in the storm that woke me up and kept me from freezing, sort of like the voice in the storm when I was a kid, or the decision to go south to Tucson instead of north to Phoenix, I realize that fate is one thing and destiny another. I haven't met my fate yet, even though I've come close many times. For now, I'll let destiny take me wherever it goes. Because for one thing, it's not only a lot more fun, it's a lifesaver. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. First of all, I'd like to thank all my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I'd also like to thank Heidi H, Chronic J, Stinky Ooze, EricaOdd, and Tracy Sellars, Kelli Clark, and Broken Angel. Then I'd like to say to everybody, I think we all know, Happy New Year. If it's already New Year for you, and Happy New Year if it's coming up for you. I've been a little blecky the past couple days, so I'm lucky I'm feeling a little bit better today. Sometimes I let myself get a little dehydrated, and I think I did that. But I've been having a lot of water today, so I feel a whole lot better. One of my New Year's quote-unquote resolutions will be to make sure I'm keeping hydrated every day. Years ago, I used to always keep track of my water, so this wouldn't happen, but I haven't done a good job of that lately. And it's really funny because now you have the apps on your phones which will record all this stuff for you, but I haven't been doing it. But I hope everybody has had a good Christmas if you celebrate it. Any other holidays, I don't really keep a track of a lot of things in the past couple of months. I've just been kind of ignoring like news and stuff and just trying to take it easy. But I definitely hope that everybody had a good holiday for any holidays that you celebrate. And for those that didn't, I still hope you had a good time. If you liked the video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat and you'd like to be, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of new videos. Leave me a comment, which I'll do my best to get back to, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address provided in the description. And now, I'd like to thank all of my free Patreon members, starting with Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H., Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, Evil Black Cat, Lori Hicks, Lisa Herman, and Krystal Robin. But most importantly, don't forget to check in your closet and check under your bed because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.